Okay, thank you everybody for joining. My name is Kate Lee. I'm a biostatistician at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, and I will be your chair for today. I'm also chair of the ACTA STING Statistics and Trials Interest Group, who are running this webinar today. So we're going to be hearing about charting the contents of DSMBs, and we've got two great presenters today. We've got Dr. Lisa Eckstein, who's the CTIQ Director and Ethics Specialist for Bellbury Limited. And we've also got Professor Seema Shan, who is an Associate Professor of Pediatrics at Lurie Children and Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. So welcome, both of you. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. Here I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and pay respect to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here today. So just a few bits of housekeeping. If you have any questions, you can ask any time during the presentation, but can you use the chat function or the Q&A function, and we'll probably leave the questions to the end, and there'll be a chance to, like I say, if you ask them during, we'll try and keep track of it, and then if you have any questions at the end, we'll nudge you to ask them, and hopefully we'll hear some answers from Lisa and Seema. And we are recording the webinar, so you can watch it at your own leisure later on. And there will be a survey after the seminar, so any feedback would be much appreciated. Is there anything else, Bernie? So I have just introduced the speakers. So we've got Lisa and Seema. You can read their full bios there, but I'll let them introduce themselves properly. I presume we're over to you first, Lisa. Yep. Great. Thanks so much. And yeah, we'll ask some questions at the end.
Thank you so much for that. And yeah, it's such a pleasure to speak to all of you. It's such an important special interest group for ACTA, and Seema and I are delighted to be here. Seema is actually going to start us off today, and Seema is going to give some broad context to the project that she led that this piece of work fell under, and why we thought it was really important to look at the ethics of data monitoring committees and some of the broader context. And then I will go through the more specific findings that we had when it came to doing an exploratory analysis of DMC charters. So I'll let Seema kick us off.
Hello, everyone. It's really nice to be here. It's very late for me, so if I'm slow, then please attribute it to the time difference. But I'm really excited to present these findings and to give you a little bit of context about the broader project. And I'm curious how some of what we found might relate to your experience. I'd love to hear about that at the end, if possible. So all of this work came out of a Greenwell Foundation grant entitled Ethics in the Interim, Learning from the COVID-19 Pandemic to Develop Ethical Guidance for Data and Safety Monitoring Committees Overseeing Clinical Trials. So what are data monitoring committees or data and safety monitoring boards? I think with this audience, you all likely know, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, this is a committee that is set up to assess at intervals during the course of a trial how the trial is going, to look at ongoing data as it accrues, and recommend whether the trial should continue, be modified, or be terminated. And of course, there's different terminology, but both DSMBs and DMCs are terms that we use interchangeably. And as you likely know, these committees often include statisticians and clinicians, but sometimes include ethicists, and they have a unique role to play because for randomized controlled trials, they are the only ones who are supposed to look at unblinded data and recommend whether something should be changed about the trial. During the COVID pandemic, the importance of data and safety monitoring committees became more widely recognized. And in the United States, one of the perhaps most prominent ways that people became aware of data and safety monitoring boards was based on the monitoring of the COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials. And the people who served on those trials were described as heroes by Larry Corey in this editorial accompanying an article that really just laid out what this committee did. He argued, he said, never have so many of us in investigative medicine owed so much to so few, paraphrasing Winston Churchill. So this, I think, is really one of the times when the public started to become aware of the role that data and safety monitoring boards play. But one of the interesting things to us is that data and safety monitoring boards are often implicitly exercising ethical judgment about clinical trials. And this article by David Demetz and Susan Ellenberg talked about how the monitoring is motivated primarily by an ethical imperative. And the idea is that if the trial involves treatments intended to prevent or delay serious outcomes, one would want to stop the trial and make the superior treatment available as soon as the evidence was definitive to protect the interests of future patients. And despite this ethical importance of the work that DMCs or DSMBs do, the work itself is often highly technical and is governed by bespoke non-public documents that often only implicitly address the ethical issues. So the protocol, the statistical analysis plan, any stopping boundaries that are created, those things are not always available. And in particular, the Data Monitoring Committee Charter is one of the most important documents that lays out what a data monitoring committee should do. And yet there's very limited access to charters from others outside of the data monitoring committee and the sponsor. So our project was really to try and understand and learn from the COVID-19 pandemic to see what it was that data and safety monitoring committees might be missing in terms of ethical guidance because of this implicit approach that they take, and to develop this guidance based on the gaps that we identified. So we first aimed to comprehensively identify existing guidance for DMC decision-making, and this included a systematic review of the ethics literature, which has uncovered a lot of literature, so it's still ongoing, and then a content analysis of available charters regarding the ethical issues they discussed. And this second piece is the piece that we will be talking about today and that Lisa will go into more depth about. We also wanted to identify and target key ethical challenges requiring guidance for data and safety monitoring committees. And we did qualitative interviews with DMC members. And then we wanted to develop decision-making tools for DMCs facing ethical issues. So we developed a paper that lays out a framework that addresses the ethical issues and tries to harmonize the ethics literature with the biomedical and statistical literatures about data and safety monitoring boards. But what we'll do now is focus on this content analysis of the available charters. And I'm really excited to present these data to you because they were so hard to obtain. It was really tireless work on Lisa's part that made it possible. And I think they're really interesting. It's interesting to peek under the hood and see what's happening. So I think with that, I will turn it over to Lisa.
Now that I'm unmuted. Thank you, Seema. It's so fabulous to have Seema join us. Seema's based in Chicago, so it's 9 o'clock at night for her. So it's really fabulous that she was able to be here, and she was the incredible leader for this project. I should reiterate, Seema and I both have a legal and bioethical background. Neither of us are statisticians, and so we're really interested to speak with this group today to get more insights from all of you about your views on what we found in these charters and what you think is important here for future work and thinking and training and education. As Seema mentioned, one of the things we really wanted to do with this project is get a sense of what DMC charters were looking like in practice. As some or all of you may know, there is some best practice guidance when it comes to what should be included in a charter for DMCs or what rules a DMC should operate under, but we have very little information about what charters are looking like, particularly given these are drafted on a trial-by-trial basis much of the time by project sponsors. So it's very different, for example, to my more familiar home of HREC, regulations where we have the national statement. We have a very regulated environment for how HRECs and in the States IRBs operate, how they make decisions, how they should be constituted. All those things are set out very publicly and very comprehensively. And that's very different when we come to DMCs. So the first thing we wanted to do was find charters that we would be able to analyse. And this, as Seema mentioned, was not the most straightforward. Our initial plan was that we were going to contact the corresponding author for recently published infectious diseases and COVID trials to ask them to send us a copy of their DMC charter. The idea was that way we would be able to really focus our attention on one group of charters, those in the areas of infectious disease, that had been published in high-quality medical journals, particularly those that already had requirements for trial protocols to be provided on publication. Now, let's just say this didn't end up going quite as expeditiously as we may have initially hoped. After contacting 30 of these trials, we were able to get 5 charters that were provided to us, which was wonderful. It was excellent that some of our corresponding authors and trial sponsors were willing to share these DMC charters. However, only one of them was for a commercially sponsored trial. The remainder were for publicly sponsored trials, particularly those that had NIH funding or were being done by cooperative trial groups. So we had to pivot a little bit because we really wanted to make sure that the charters we were accessing had a broader snapshot of the sector than those large publicly sponsored trials, which led to approach 2, which was a systematic literature review for charters that had been included as supplementary materials to trial publications. And we are increasingly seeing at least some of these wherein supplementary materials alongside the trial protocol will be the statistical analysis plan and in some instances the DMC charter. So that provided us with an additional 5 charters, with 2 of them being from commercially sponsored trials. Finally, in a desperate plea to get additional commercially sponsored trials, we did a review of litigation document discovery. As some of you may know, when litigation happens, a lot of documents need to be produced, and those documents are then available to researchers to use for research purposes. And that unearthed an additionally 3 commercially sponsored trials, all in oncology. So now we had quite a heterogeneous sample, one might say. We'd moved from our initial conception of infectious disease trial charters to a much broader group of clinical trial DMC charters. But we did think that we had the breadth of DMC charters now available to us, that we could do an analysis of it as a convenient sample, particularly given that so little was publicly available to the community now. We did feel like it was enough to be able to move forward with an exploratory analysis. Which then came to our method for how we were going to analyse these. I won't go into the methodology in depth, but it is in our article if you want to look at it. Essentially, what we did was what's called a summative content analysis, which really digs into the details of the texts in front of us, being the DMC charters, and looks for both the words that are used, so the way that DMC responsibilities are described, as well as some of that latent meaning to the words. So, for example, if a charter says that DMCs can review unmasked trial data but doesn't provide any way for the DMCs to access that unmasked data, that would be something that would be unearthed through a summative content analysis. In order to structure our analysis, we drew upon the highly influential Damocles Study Group proposed charter for clinical trial data monitoring committees as being an influential document for how DMC charters should be structured, to allow us to measure the charters that we had against a best practice guidance. I'm not going to go through all of these content groups today. We do have limited time. So I picked out the ones that I thought were most interesting, particularly to this group of people, but happy to talk about any of these in the question time, should there be ones I don't talk about that you have a particular interest in. The first one I wanted to look at with you was the roles and overall responsibilities of the DMC. What is the crux of what our DMCs are being asked to do? What role are they being asked by the sponsor to perform? One question in here was whether committees were being asked to focus purely on safety data, whether they were looking at safety and efficacy data, and if they were just focusing on safety data, were they restricted in using efficacy data to being able to contextualise that safety information? While 2 of the charters did have a primary focus on safety review, we were pleased to see that all 13 of the charters that we analysed allowed the DMC to review efficacy data to get a better sense of the meaning of the safety data that they were being presented with. So that was consistent with what we considered to be best practice guidance. We were also interested in how DMCs were being guided in the Charter about when they should be considering making recommendations to terminate, amend, or otherwise modify the trial. Now, many of you will be familiar with the idea that statistical or numerical stopping boundaries are there as guidelines rather than rules. I think that most people, I would hazard a guess on this call, would be very uncomfortable with any idea that a statistical stopping boundary should be the be-all and end-all of DMC decision-making. Most of us would want to know that there was additional context being considered at the time that a stopping boundary was being approached, or indeed after a stopping boundary had been reached, where the DMC was having those broader discussions about whether that meant a recommendation should be made to the trial sponsor or the trial steering committee about changes. This was where things were quite interesting. So we had quite a lot of charters that included a numerical stopping boundary, often a very highly detailed one, but didn't have additional guidance for the DMC as to how they should interpret the stopping boundary should it be reached. So, for example, should they be considering about whether the data was sufficient to change clinical practice? Should they be considering whether the data meant that equipoise had been disturbed or that there might be undue harm on participants? Those could all lead you to different decisions as to whether or not to make a recommendation that the trial should be changed. But that wasn't elucidated in most of the charters that we saw. There was also one charter in particular that didn't have a numerical stopping boundary, but instead asked the DMC to make a recommendation for termination of the trial at any point if it's not ethical to continue. That asks that DMC to make a really difficult determination and quite a contested determination, because depending on what ethical stance you take or what ethical principle should be guiding a decision whether to terminate, different DMC members might, at very different points of evidence generation, start to feel like it's not ethical to continue. So that can be a source of moral distress for DMC members and something that could be challenging for DMCs to work through. And I want to come back to this a little bit in a few slides' time when I talk to what the charters had to say about decision-making processes. One of the challenges that's been written about for DMCs, particularly by authors like David Demetz, is what often comes about as a lack of sponsor indemnification for DMCs doing their work. Now, we haven't seen many or any legal cases I'm aware of where DMC members have been directly held liable or been brought to legal proceedings for the way that they performed their role. But there certainly is the potential that that could happen. And it's reasonable that DMC members would be really cautious about taking on such a weighty role. Seema talked about the weightiness of the role that they had in the COVID-19 pandemic in the absence of express sponsor indemnification for them. We only saw one of our 13 charters that explicitly included provision for indemnification for DMC members. Now, it's possible that for some of our other trials, indemnification was provided for members, but just not available in the charter. It could have been provided by a separate letter to DMC members, for example. But from what we saw, only one of those charters included that protection for members. A lot of the DMC charter that we analysed detailed issues as to documentation, who was providing DMC with information, at what time periods, through what process, which is all as you'd expect for DMC charters. And that was quite reasonable that there was a lot of differences between how the charters were doing that. That makes total sense, particularly given we were looking at quite a heterogeneous snapshot of trials. All of the charters allowed for DMCs to receive both efficacy and safety data at some or all meetings, although there was one charter that advised that DMCs would be reviewing efficacy data but didn't include efficacy data in any of the documentation that was said to be provided. So there was a bit of a disconnect there. We also saw that most of the charters did provide DMCs with access to unmasked or unblinded data, which again is consistent with best practice recommendations. Though we did see one commercially sponsored trial charter that limited DMC review to masked or blinded data only, which we know from the literature can cause challenges when it comes to interpretation if things get to something of the pointy end. At the time we were doing our analysis, we were also quite interested in what provisions the DMC charters made for information sharing. And I'm going to be cautious here because I don't want to in any way suggest that DMC information should be shared haphazardly. Many of you who've served on DMCs or worked with DMCs will be aware that confidentiality of that emerging trial data is absolutely paramount. There can be significant harms to trial validity should that emerging trial data be released prematurely or in a way that isn't really thought through. However, we also have seen situations where the ability to share emerging trial data in a very contained, secure way can allow better public health outcomes. Let me give you an example here. I believe many of you will be aware of the support trial in the US and trials that have explored the most optimal oxygen saturation level that can be provided for prematurely born infants. At the time when the support trial was ongoing in the US, there were 5 similar trials that were running more or less in parallel, and it's at least possible that some of you on this call were involved in some of them. We had trials going on in the USA, in New Zealand, Canada, Australia, and the UK. The US, being the speedy place it is, reported their trial results first, and their results showed a marginally statistically significant higher level of mortality with the lower levels of oxygen. So obviously that is something that is extremely concerning for those trials that have a very, very similar protocol design that are still ongoing. When those results were reported, the chair of the UK-based data monitoring committee reached out to the Canadian and Australasian Data Monitoring Committee chairs saying, look, do you think we should share our emerging data and do a pooled meta-analysis so that we can get a sense of whether it is ethical to keep our studies going, or whether between the data that we've all accumulated thus far, we feel like we've got a sufficiently valid evidence base to recommend that a change be made. When the request was made, and this is published in an article by Ian Chalmers, reportedly the Canadian Trial Steering Committee refused to release its data for this purpose. It said, no, the risk to confidentiality, the risk of premature disclosure, it's just too high. We're not going to release our data. UK and Australasia, however, did pull their results, and apparently that provided the respective trial steering committees with the confidence to cease recruitment, to say, actually, this risk to our neonates is too high. So we do have situations where that ability to share data in a constrained way has the potential to be beneficial. We only saw one charter that made any allowance for information sharing with other data monitoring committees or otherwise, which was not necessarily surprising, but was interesting. And I think it's notable that that charter that did make provision for information sharing was for a large adaptive COVID-19 trial where perhaps those drafting the DMC charter were thinking in advance about the potential need to be sharing information with DMCs of other trials running in parallel. Now, I may have mentioned that I have a legal background. And so for me, looking at the trial charters, the thing that most catches my attention with that background is how DMCs are entrusted with making decisions. As we talked about earlier, a lot of the decisions that DMCs are making, Seema talked about the latent ethics of it. They're judgment calls. They're not things where there's necessarily a clear-cut yes or no answer when things start to reach that difficult pointy end, what David Demetz has described as the agonising negative trend that can appear. Instead, situations will come up where the data is starting to look difficult and conversations need to happen among members about what to do. We talked about the fact that often there'll be statistical stopping guidelines, but those boundaries are guidelines and not rules. Now, what I think was really interesting in the charters that we looked at was how few of them included information about how DMCs were expected to make decisions and what to do if they didn't agree, either within the DMC itself or where the DMC made a recommendation that the trial steering committee or sponsor didn't agree with. So, few of them talked about this at all. So a lot of them just included no information about decision-making. Some of them did include information about decision-making, but it was sparse or suboptimal. So, for example, some of them had that if the DMC disagrees, then voting should be used as the decision-making tool. Now, voting isn't necessarily bad, but according to the best practice guidance issued by groups like Damocles, that should be used as a last resort. Consensus-based decision-making should be used in preference. And finally, one of them included provision for an outside consultant to be used, an arbiter, in the event that consensus couldn't be reached by the DMC, which was a really interesting approach, but one that we only saw in that one. Similarly, sparse guidance for disputes between the data monitoring committee and the trial sponsor. Again, there was very, very little information in the charter about what course of action should be taken if the DMC was to make a recommendation that the trial sponsor or steering committee disagreed with. And so that leaves not only a gap where I might think about procedurally or legally, but this huge source of moral distress. If you're in a group, you're the only people that have access to this highly confidential information, but there's no clear path forward for what to do if you're disagreeing with each other. And that was something that I thought was really important to see in the charters, and something that we as a community might want to think about as we move forward in this space. Finally, we saw really mixed ideas in the charters about what, if any, role a DMC should have after a trial completes. So we saw 2 charters that expressly allowed for the DMC to have input into the results manuscript and the Drug Regulatory Authority submissions. That was in 2 of them. We had 1 charter that seemed to expressly preclude the DMC from having any role in this space, that stated at the conclusion of the trial, the DSMB's responsibility to the studies cease. So that seems pretty clear that the DMC's out for that. 2 of them had ambiguous statements about post-trial roles. They sort of said something that might suggest that maybe the DMC had a role, but it wasn't very clear. And 8 of them were completely silent. Now, why does this matter? DMCs are the people that are going to be most familiar with how the sausage was made. They're going to be the people that are most intimately connected with that data that has been produced by the trial. And sometimes that may mean that when trial results are publicised, that they see that there is an inconsistency there with the data that they saw. And that's actually something that we saw during the COVID pandemic. Some of you may remember at the time that a lot of early results from the COVID vaccine trials were being produced, there was a lot of discussion about the different vaccines, the comparison between them, and one of them was the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine. And in February 2021, AstraZeneca made a very public, very happy announcement that based on its interim data, there was 79% efficacy of the COVID vaccine that they were producing. DMC members saw that announcement and the data that was based on, and had a concern that it was based on an incomplete data set. What they said was the data set that had been used by AstraZeneca in coming to that 79% efficacy figure was based on data that had a cutoff date in February. And if the data cutoff date was extended to March, my dates must be slightly wrong here, but you get the sense that if the data cutoff date was extended 1 month later, there were additional COVID cases that had arisen that may mean that the efficacy AstraZeneca had published was overstated. After the DMC unusually had publicly come out with that rebuke, AstraZeneca redid its figures with the extra month of data and revised it to 76% efficacy. So it went from 79% to 76%, not a earth-shattering change, but enough that I think it illustrates the potential role that DMCs play when it comes to the post-trial space. So where to next? I'm really glad that we've got some time to discuss, and hopefully we'll have some really robust, thoughtful questions from all of you. But I do have some thoughts, and as a group, we've certainly been talking about where do we move forward with this, because we think that data monitoring committees are an under-researched area, and an area that hasn't received the kind of support and training that really is commensurate with the incredibly weighty role that they serve. So one of the things that we think could be useful in this space is additional model charters developed by sponsors or institutions, preferably publicly available, that explicitly address the key ethical issues, including the ones we've talked about today. I also think we need to better equip our human research ethics committees for the role that they play in interacting with DMCs. HRECs are the principal body in Australia and internationally that has the remit to protect the safety of participants. But when it comes to DMCs, in large part, HRECs delegate that authority to DMCs during the course of the trial. Because the last thing we want is all of the reviewing HRECs to also have access to all of this highly confidential emerging trial data that they don't have the expertise to properly assess. But it does mean that HRECs need to be equipped to look at DMC compositions, potentially DMC charters, and be able to make a determination as to whether those are sufficiently robust for the trial at hand. And HRECs are going to need support with this. Finally, we need to ensure that our DMC members are able to have time to review charters before agreeing to serve on a DMC and have the support that they need to be able to know whether the charter that they've been provided with is going to sufficiently protect them as a DMC member through the course of a trial. And again, I'd be really interested to hear from those of you in the webinar today who do serve on DMCs, the extent to which you are given that trial charter in advance and the extent to which you feel equipped to be able to review the provisions in it. So I think with that, it's probably a good time to hand over to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Lisa and Seema. It's very interesting talk, and it's given me a lot to think about, and hopefully others too. Just before we get going, Bernie, I don't know if it's possible to be able to unmute people and make this a bit of a discussion, because like Lisa says, I think it would be really good to be able to hear from the people on the webinar. I mean, if it's not possible, we'll have to do it through the chat. But if we can unmute people and let people join the discussion, I think that would be really useful.
We should be able to, if people could put their hand up so I know who to unmute.
Okay, that would be great. So I'd like, to encourage everyone to join the discussion. And there's no questions posted at the moment. So please post any questions in the chat or put your hand up, which would be good. I was just going to start quickly and say, about charter templates. I mean, hearing that, especially all the discussion about the lack of decision-making information in there, having templates can really help with that. And I know the Melbourne Children's Trials Centre, where I work, which is at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, we do actually have a template that we encourage our staff to use, and it does have things about decision making in. It doesn't have anything about the role of the DSMB after the end of the trial. I mean, we typically don't get too involved after the end of the trial, but I think having templates can really help with some of this and really increase the quality of DSMB charters. Just another quick comment I was going to make is, should we be making charters available online? As part, we all try and make our protocols, we make our SAPs available online. And I don't think there's anything, as far as I'm aware, sort of secretive in the charter or that shouldn't be shared. But I think that would be a good practice to get into for transparency and for quality. So, maybe we should be encouraging charters as part of the trial publication or part of the trial registration or, wherever it might be, as long as it's online and you can point to it. I think that would be a good practice to get into.
I don't know if Seema wants to speak to this, because Seema, we did a comment piece on a proposal for almost exactly that recommendation, that clinicaltrials.gov should include a space for people to upload the DMC charter. I don't know if you want to talk to that anymore, Seema.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, with regard to your first comment, I think absolutely having templates helps. One of the key questions, though, is how do we determine what's in the templates and make them more standardized? I think many institutions have them, but there's probably a fair amount of variability even between what one institution has compared to another. And, some of these things I think are things about which reasonable people may disagree. And others may be things where if we all put our heads together, we would agree that it's useful to say something about it. So, some sort of the Damocles charter process happened and was published in 2005. So it may be that there's a need for some sort of larger scale revisitation of that. The NIH is currently in the US is currently undergoing a review of data monitoring and clinical trials, and it may be but they're revamping their policy and not so much thinking about their template. And I think the other thing is also, there should be some ability to craft a charter for a specific trial. As I'm sure you all have experienced, there might be specific things that need to be addressed. So it would be nice to have templates or checklists that you could compare to a charter and have some negotiation about what actually is included in it. And then with respect to the publication of charters, this is something that David Demet and others have recommended should start happening, although they recommended it on a voluntary basis for them to be included in clinicaltrials.gov. And we published a commentary, which I will find a link for and put in the chat, arguing that really, if you make it voluntary, it's unlikely that will be something that people do. And even recognizing there are many bureaucratic requirements that clinical trialists have to do, it seems like there's a lot of value to having charters be made routinely available. And there may be some proprietary information that needs to be stricken from the charter, but there's a lot that could be posted. So I think that is a really wise policy, and we would learn a lot from that. But it is something there's some resistance to. I see we have more questions.
I was going to say consensus-driven approach on both of those things might be a good way forward.
I agree.
Great, thank you. Cecilia, did you want to jump in?
Hi, can you hear us?
Yes, we can.
Great, thanks for the talk, Lisa. I just had a comment about the need for context when DMCs are implementing early stopping for efficacy and when that's being pre-specified. I'm not at all experienced in this kind of thing, but I'm helping design a trial with the DMC chair, the future DMC chair, who is very experienced. And he and others have commented to me that they actually would prefer that the pre-specified adaptive rules are relatively unambiguous. So when I've sort of tried to use language that has allowed latitude for context and so on, they've actually pushed back and said, well, something like they prefer unambiguous rules so that it's clearer when they are actually playing their hand to override the pre-specified flow of the trial. So I just think that's sort of a countervailing consideration to, language giving the DMC lots of latitude to consider context.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. Thank you for that comment. And I think the two work together. I think what I'd say from the charters that we reviewed is having clear guidance is really important. Having those clear stopping boundaries that give DMCs a very, very clear sense of when their hand might be coming into play, but then also providing DMCs with those broader ways of thinking about how they should be interpreting the stopping guidelines. So, for example, having the stopping guideline, but as well as that, having when this would be sufficient evidence to lead to a change in clinical practice. And then the DMC might be able to say, well, look, we're reaching the stopping boundary, but there's these three things we're seeing in the data that actually make us think we're probably not at the point yet where there's enough evidence for a change in clinical practice. And then you have those two working side by side, rather than either only having the stopping boundary itself, where the DMC then might be thinking, well, we're reaching the stopping boundary, but it's just not sitting right with us, or only having a broad statement such as when it's no longer ethical to continue, when you're then asking the DMC to perform this really, really difficult ethical judgment without a whole lot of support, because they can't really ask for support because it's all so highly confidential.
If I could just add to that, I think maybe the questioner was also thinking about the context of adaptive clinical trials, where, you know, changes are being recommended to the trial design. And I do think that in some ways is a slightly separate context where people think that it can be beneficial to have less discretion, partially because of the concern about bias with the changes that might be made if a DSMB is looking at interim data and then making decisions about how that trial is designed based on what they're seeing. So that might be a slightly different context than a standard clinical trial where it really is just the question of whether the trial should continue or be stopped as the primary consideration. There's really interesting literature on adaptive clinical trials and the role of DSMBs, and a fair amount of debate where I think some very experienced DSMB members are uncomfortable with even the idea of adaptive clinical trials, and others feel like they're actually a really important innovation forward. So I do think that context is something that's slightly different and may raise different kinds of considerations.
Thank you.
Yeah, all very good points. Thank you, everybody. Peter, over to you.
Hi, thank you. I'm not quite sure this is my question's slightly out of the scope of this, but I was just wondering and interested in your thoughts on whether industry-sponsored trials in early phase should be adopting a DSMB, which is obviously independent, or whether early phase clinical trials internal safety review committee is appropriate.
Lisa, did you want to take this, or I have a couple quick thoughts on it?
You start with yours and I'll add on if there's extra thoughts I have.
Yeah, of course. So it's interesting. One of the NIH in the United States recently had a webinar looking at revising its clinical trial monitoring oversight. And one of the things that they really articulated as an important principle was the idea that there's this concern there are too many DSMBs, that it takes a lot of time, and this is in some ways a limited or scarce resource because there aren't that many people who can serve on these DSMBs. So there is this concern that, you know, we may have started just having them for lots of different kinds of trials, and that's not always necessary. So I do think there's some sense that maybe we need to figure out what are the trials that really require them and which ones don't. I do think there's this interesting question about, you know, trials where so early phase trials, if there isn't any randomization occurring, it may not be as critical. But there's also this question about industry sponsors and whether having some independent voices in the room could be helpful. And it depends, of course, on the endpoints and what it is that we think could happen in the course of the trial. So I think there still could be a role for DSMBs in some cases. But I do think this question of really articulating, you know, is it because the risk to participants is so high, or because we want independent voices in, you know, with a sponsor where we're concerned that there may be some bias in the trial, right? It's important to articulate that principle and not just sort of recommend a DSMB as a solution in all cases.
Thanks, Seema. Lisa, did you want to add anything?
No, Seema covered it really well. I would agree with all of that. I would also just add in the Australian context that one of the decisions that HRECs are entrusted with making is whether the data monitoring frameworks that have been established for a trial that they're reviewing, whether they're adequate. So that's one of the tasks that's given to ethics committees, but I'm not convinced that we have supported our ethics committees with actually being able to answer that question. Seema spoke to some of the complexities there. I think that in some senses, we need to make sure that we are setting our ethics committees up for success in how they make that determination. And we can't end up in a situation where every trial has a DMC. We just don't have that number of biostatisticians that can serve on them in particular. They're also quite expensive and time consuming, and we want medical research to happen, and we don't want medical research to be constrained by governance requirements that aren't proportionate. So I don't know that there's an easy answer other than we need to have those national and international conversations to have the benchmarks to equip those like ethics committees making decisions to be able to make them well.
I was just going to add my thoughts here. I'm very in favour of DSMBs, or DMCs, but I do recognise there are trials that don't need them, and I think thinking about whether it's actually needed for the particular trial in question is important. And again, at the Melbourne Children's Trial Centre, we do have a document that kind of discusses when they are and when they're not needed, because, as you say, there are limited resources. It's things we tend to do without any remuneration, and you can't just, there's no point having one for the sake of having one if you don't need one. So I think thinking about different scenarios and whether you actually need it is quite handy. So Sabine Bratz asked a question in the chat. What are your views around making the names of the members of the DSMB public either during or after the trial? And she notes there's a recommendation to include them in the publication after asking consent, but that's not always done. So what are your thoughts about making the names of the DSMB members publicly available?
Lisa, do you want to start on this one?
So I would say after the trial, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think in the same way that we're increasingly making peer reviewer names publicly available, I would think of DMC names in the same way. And I also think that DMC member names should be available on request to the reviewing ethics committee when it's making a determination about whether the DMC is appropriate. I think it is a different calculation where the DMC member names are made available while the trial is ongoing, and I would have some reservations about that, knowing that that might result in pressure on DMC members. They have a very difficult job to do, and they are the only people that have access to that information. It could lead to some problematic situations if DMC members are being cajoled for information. But I certainly think that after a clinical trial, the equation becomes much simpler. I don't know if Seema wants to add to that at all.
I agree with that. When we did qualitative interviews with DMC members, they did mentioned that he would go to national meetings, and when people knew that he was on a DMC, they would sort of ask him questions and watch him very closely for his reaction. And I think it is a challenge when DMC members are engaged in their work. I think one important thing is we wrote this paper attempting to have consensus with a wide group of members of data monitoring committees and people with relevant expertise. And it was fairly contentious, this issue of should the HREC or the IRB have the names of the DSMB members and sort of evaluate whether there was sufficient expertise for a given clinical trial. I think to me, that seemed like a reasonable thing to do and could be quite valuable, but some people were concerned that HRECs and IRBs wouldn't actually have that expertise. And then one thing I will say about publications is, I guess it used to be standard for DSMB members to be on publications. And then people raised concerns about that being a conflict of interest. So that has changed. I suspect what you're suggesting, Sabine, is acknowledgement of the DSMB and their role in shepherding the trial. And I think that could make sense. But then again, it seems important that the DSMB has the ability to review that paper and see how their role is described and any recommendations that they made, if they're described in the paper, that those are accurate. And that, to me, is something it doesn't seem like from our data that that's routinely done.
Thank you very much. We've got a couple of minutes left. If anyone's got any more questions, please pop them in the chat. There's also a couple of useful documents gone into the chat, so if you want to look there and find those. I was interested that you found that all 13 permitted reviewing of efficacy data. And I know you said that a lot actually had formal stopping rules. Generally, I try and get my trialists to not give efficacy data unless there is a formal stopping rule, because I think, if it's any kind, if it's got a stopping rule or it's adaptive, then yes, they need some efficacy data to do that. But unless they actually know what to do with that, I tend to try and avoid any efficacy data. So I'd be interested in your sort of thoughts on that, and whether you disagree or if you tend to do that even without stopping rules.
So not all of them required or asked the DMC to make an efficacy assessment. There were some that very clearly said, we only want you to make assessments about safety. But what they did do is allow the DMC either routinely or on request to obtain efficacy data to help contextualise the safety data.
And I will add, in the paper that we were writing, we had some debates about whether efficacy data should routinely be provided. There were many, but not all, members of our group who thought it was important, because they felt that in order to really understand the safety data, sometimes you need to have the context for the efficacy data, and that there was a worry that DSMBs couldn't make valid judgments about and recommendations about stopping trials without that in some cases. So I do think there were some question, there were still some people who were holdouts on that. And especially I think with vaccine trials, there was a thought that safety data alone is really what the DSMB should be focused on.
I guess as a statistician, I'm a bit worried about people seeing, a difference in treatment effects based on a few people and not thinking about uncertainty, or, doing a quick calculation, getting a p-value of less than 0.05 at the first interim and making some rash decision based on it, which is why my hesitation. I'm like,
so the other thing we did see that potentially might allay that concern is some charters that specifically said, we don't want the DMC to make any recommendations before it has, say, 6 months of data, or before it has, so sort of essentially saying that until you have this level of data, until you've seen this many rounds of the treatment or had this many updates, you shouldn't be making a recommendation. And so I was trying to get to the concern that you're raising, but through another way of structuring it to try and minimise the likelihood that a DMC might make a recommendation in situations when the data was still in such a degree of flux.
Yeah, and I think as long as they are aware of that, and that would be helped by having a statistician who understood all this on the DSMB, and you'd hope DSMBs have a statistician.
This is another thing that's come up in the work that Seema and I were doing, that a lot of the DMC charters and DMC guidance is based on the assumption that DMCs will include what we might think of as a DMC elder, someone that has been involved in DMCs for a long time. A lot of these sort of original founders of DMCs as a concept that have internalized a lot of those norms and are able to guide the DMC towards them. But because we're starting to outstrip the number of those people that are able to serve on all of the DMCs, we have to be in some ways more thoughtful in what we put in the charters, because we don't necessarily have that internalized wisdom necessarily living within the DMC.
And another component of that is thinking about training of DMC members. It's really interesting. The Cystic Fibrosis Foundation has a very comprehensive training approach, and they include ethicists and patient advocates on their data monitoring committees, but they also train them and especially give them even talks about how to look at large volumes of data and interpret them. So I do think there's some need, if you're going to have such an interdisciplinary group work together, to have that cross-training and develop more of that.
Yeah, I think training is really important. We actually in Sting do have a DSMB mentoring program for statisticians. So you get paired up with someone who's done it before and on a DSMB, and you get to sit through DSMBs with them and hear the thoughts and the feedback from the statistician. And I know there has been a call to do that more broadly across ACTA. And it's something we would love to do, but it's having the capacity and someone to actually, or a team to actually run it. But I think you do need some of those skills passed between DSMBs, and I think training and mentoring is very important in this field. So I think it's just on one, so I think we're going to have to wrap up. But thank you so much, both of you. I hope everyone's found it a really interesting and helpful discussion. I know I have. It was great presentations, and thank you, Seema, in particular, for it being late at night. And hopefully you're not too wired after all the discussion, and you can get to bed soon.
It has been very stimulating. I appreciate all the excellent questions.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for having us.
Great.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
So much fun.
Great. Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back with future webinars. Thanks, everyone.